The game has changed, and nobody saw it coming. For decades, Washington took Mexico for granted. A neighbor, a trading partner, a place where American influence was simply assumed. But right now, as we speak, there's a quiet battle happening south of our border that could reshape the entire hemisphere. China isn't just knocking on Mexico's door anymore. They're walking through it with investment deals, infrastructure projects, and economic partnerships that would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago. And Donald Trump, he's watching this unfold with the kind of alarm that comes from realizing you might be losing something you never thought you could lose. Standing right in the middle of this geopolitical chess match is President Claudia Sheinbaum, and she holds cards that both superpowers desperately want. This isn't about Mexico choosing sides. It's about Mexico finally having the leverage to negotiate on its own terms. The question isn't whether this competition will reshape North American power dynamics. It's whether the United States understands how fundamentally the rules have already changed. Because what happens in Mexico City over the next few years won't just affect Mexico, it will determine who dominates the Western Hemisphere for the next generation. Let me be very clear about what we're witnessing here, because the mainstream media isn't going to tell you this story the way it needs to be told. They'll give you the headlines, the surface level analysis, the same tired narratives about Trump's tough talk and China's ambitions. But what's actually happening in Mexico right now is a fundamental restructuring of global economic power. And it's happening right under our noses while most Americans are completely unaware of the implications. Think about this for a moment. For over a century, the United States has treated Latin America, and Mexico in particular, as its backyard. It's a term you hear all the time in foreign policy circles, and it's not an accident. It's deliberate. It reflects a worldview where American dominance in the Western Hemisphere is simply taken for granted, where the countries south of the Rio Grande exist primarily to serve American economic and strategic interests. The Monroe Doctrine, which dates back to 1823, essentially declared that the Americas were off limits to European colonial powers. But what it really meant was that this hemisphere belonged to the United States. And for generations, that's exactly how it worked. But here's what the foreign policy establishment in Washington didn't see coming. They were so focused on the Middle East, so obsessed with their forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, so consumed with pivoting to Asia to contain China in the Pacific, that they stopped paying attention to what was happening in their own neighborhood. And China, with its characteristic long-term strategic thinking, saw an opportunity. While American politicians were debating border walls and immigration policy, while they were imposing tariffs and making threats, China was quietly building relationships, signing trade deals, investing in infrastructure, and creating economic dependencies that are now reshaping the entire geopolitical landscape of the Americas. Now let's talk about Claudia Sheinbaum, because her story is absolutely crucial to understanding what's happening right now. She's not just another politician who happened to win an election. She's a scientist, a Nobel Prize winning climate researcher, someone who comes from the academic and intellectual world rather than the traditional political establishment. She's also the first woman president in Mexico's history, which in itself represents a massive shift in a country that has been dominated by machismo culture for centuries. But more importantly, she's a pragmatist who understands that Mexico's future depends on playing the major powers against each other to extract the best possible deal for her country. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Scheinbaum isn't ideological in the way American politicians often are. She's not anti-American and she's not pro-Chinese. She's pro-Mexico. And that simple fact is what makes this situation so complex and so consequential. She inherited a country that has been economically dominated by the United States for generations, where the economy is deeply integrated with the American market through NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA. Roughly 80% of Mexico's exports go to the United States. That's an enormous dependency. and historically it's meant that Mexico had very little leverage in bilateral negotiations. But China's emergence as a global economic superpower has changed that calculation entirely. Suddenly, Mexico has options. China needs markets for its goods, it needs resources, it needs strategic footholds in the Western Hemisphere to counterbalance American influence. And Mexico, with its massive population, its strategic location right on the American border, its abundant natural resources, and its growing manufacturing base, is exactly what China is looking for. We're not just talking about trade deals here, we're talking about massive infrastructure investments, technology transfers, industrial partnerships, and financial arrangements that could fundamentally alter Mexico's economic orientation. Let me give you some concrete examples of what's actually happening on the ground, because this isn't theoretical. China has been investing billions of dollars in Mexican infrastructure. We're talking about ports on both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, railways, highways, telecommunications networks, energy projects. Chinese companies are building manufacturing facilities in Mexico to take advantage of USMCA trade provisions, essentially using Mexico as a backdoor into the American market. Think about the brilliance of this strategy. China can't sell directly to the United States without facing massive tariffs and political opposition. But if they manufacture goods in Mexico, those products enter the United States duty-free under existing trade agreements. And it's not just manufacturing. China is investing in Mexico's energy sector, in its mining operations, in its agricultural production. Chinese companies are buying up farmland, securing long-term contracts for critical minerals, establishing supply chains that bypass the United States entirely. This is economic statecraft at its finest, and it's working. Mexican officials are now routinely traveling to Beijing for state visits, signing memorandums of understanding, attending Belt and Road Initiative conferences. The symbolic shift is just as important as the economic one. Mexico is signaling to the world that it's no longer exclusively in the American orbit. Now, Trump sees all of this, and his response is entirely predictable. He's threatening tariffs. He's demanding that Mexico crack down on Chinese investment. He's trying to use the same bullying tactics that have defined his approach to foreign policy. And here's the problem with that approach. It doesn't work anymore. The world has changed. Mexico has options now, and threatening them just pushes them further into China's arms. Every time Trump talks about building the wall higher, every time he threatens to tear up trade agreements, every time he disparages Mexican immigrants, he's making it politically easier for Sheinbaum to pivot toward China. And let's be honest about what Trump represents in this context. He's the culmination of decades of American policy failure in Latin America. The United States has spent generations supporting coups, propping up dictators, imposing structural adjustment programs through the IMF and World Bank, extracting resources, and generally treating Latin American countries as subordinate entities rather than sovereign partners. Trump didn't invent this approach. He just stripped away the diplomatic niceties and said the quiet part out loud. But the result is the same. Resentment builds, nationalism grows, and alternative partners start looking very attractive. China, by contrast, doesn't lecture Mexico about democracy or human rights or corruption. They don't impose political conditions on their investments. They don't demand structural reforms or austerity measures. They show up with cash, with technology, with promises of mutual benefit, and they deliver. Now, we can debate whether Chinese investment comes with its own strings attached, whether there are hidden costs and long-term dependencies being created, whether this is ultimately good for Mexico. Those are legitimate questions. But from the perspective of Mexican policymakers, the choice is clear. One partner treats you as an equal and offers concrete economic benefits. The other partner takes you for granted and issues threats. And here's where the economic analysis gets really important, because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about capitalism itself and how it functions in the 21st century. The United States built its post-World War II dominance on a particular economic model. American companies would invest abroad, extract resources and cheap labor, manufacture goods, and sell them back to American consumers. This model required maintaining political control over key regions, ensuring that governments remained friendly to American business interests and preventing the emergence of rival powers who might offer alternative arrangements. China is now offering exactly that alternative arrangement. But here's the crucial difference. China's economy is still heavily state-directed. The Communist Party maintains control over key industries, directs investment according to strategic priorities, and uses economic policy as an extension of geopolitical strategy. American capitalism, by contrast, is increasingly financialized and short-term oriented. American companies care about quarterly earnings reports, stock buybacks, and shareholder returns. They've been offshoring manufacturing for decades, hollowing out the American industrial base, and focusing on financial engineering rather than actual production. This creates a fundamental asymmetry in how the United States and China approach countries like Mexico. China can offer long-term infrastructure investments that might not pay off for decades because the Chinese state is thinking in terms of centuries, not quarters. Chinese companies can accept lower profit margins because they're pursuing strategic objectives rather than just maximizing returns. American companies, bound by the logic of contemporary capitalism, can't compete with that. They need faster returns, higher profits, less risk. And so increasingly they're losing ground in the competition for influence in the developing world. Now, Sheinbaum understands all of this perfectly well. She's not naive about Chinese intentions, and she's not blind to the risks of becoming too dependent on Beijing, but she's also looking at the practical reality of Mexico's situation. Her country needs massive infrastructure investment to develop its economy. It needs technology transfer to move up the value chain. It needs access to capital for energy projects, for urban development, for education and healthcare. The United States could provide all of this, but historically it hasn't. American aid to Latin America has been stingy compared to what the US spends on military adventures in the Middle East. American companies extract wealth from Mexico, but they don't invest in the kind of long-term development projects that would actually transform the economy. So Sheinbaum is doing what any rational leader would do. She's playing both sides. She's maintaining the crucial economic relationship with the United States because 80% of your exports going to one market means you can't just walk away. But she's also cultivating the relationship with China because that gives her leverage, options, and alternative sources of investment and technology. This is a delicate balancing act, and it requires enormous political skill to pull off. Too much tilt toward China, and you provoke American retaliation. Too much deference to American demands, and you look weak domestically, and you lose the benefits of Chinese partnership. And there's a domestic political dimension to all of this that we can't ignore. Sheinbaum comes from the Morena party, which is left-leaning, nationalist, and deeply skeptical of American influence. The party was founded by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, her predecessor, who spent his entire political career railing against neoliberalism, against the privatization of Mexican state assets, against the domination of Mexican politics by wealthy elites connected to American business interests. Morena represents a genuine popular movement in Mexico, supported by working-class Mexicans who feel like they've been left behind by globalization, by NAFTA, by decades of economic policies that benefited the wealthy while leaving ordinary people struggling. For Sheinbaum to maintain her political base, she has to demonstrate that she's standing up for Mexican sovereignty, that she's not just another politician who will bend to American pressure. This means she needs wins that she can point to, concrete achievements that improve ordinary Mexicans' lives. Chinese investment can provide those wins. New factories mean jobs. New infrastructure means better transportation and lower costs. New technology partnerships mean economic development. These are tangible benefits that resonate with voters in a way that abstract appeals to maintaining the American alliance don't. But here's where it gets even more complicated, because within the United States itself, there's no unified position on how to respond to this challenge. Trump represents one approach, the nationalist, protectionist, America First approach that relies on threats and tariffs. But there are others in the American foreign policy establishment who understand that this approach is counterproductive, that it's driving Mexico and other Latin American countries into China's arms. These voices argue for a different strategy, one based on genuine partnership, massive infrastructure investment in the region, debt relief, technology transfer, treating Latin American countries as equals rather than subordinates. The problem is that this alternative approach requires resources, political will, and a fundamental rethinking of how the United States engages with its neighbors. And right now, American politics is so dysfunctional, so consumed with internal divisions, so focused on short term partisan battles that there's no capacity for this kind of strategic thinking. Congress can't even agree on a budget, much less a comprehensive strategy for countering Chinese influence in Latin America. The result is paralysis, drift, and a slow but steady erosion of American influence in the region. And let's zoom out even further, because what's happening in Mexico is part of a much larger global pattern. All around the world, countries that were once firmly in the American orbit are reassessing their options. Brazil is strengthening ties with China. Argentina is considering joining BRICS. Countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are signing on to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Saudi Arabia is selling oil to China in yuan rather than dollars. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency is being slowly but steadily challenged. American military bases that once seemed permanent fixtures are being questioned. The entire architecture of American global dominance that was built after World War II is being stress tested in ways it hasn't been since the Cold War. And the reason this is happening isn't mysterious. It's because American power was always based on a bargain. The United States would provide security, access to its massive consumer market, investment capital, and technological innovation. In exchange, other countries would accept American political leadership, host American military bases, align their foreign policies with American interests, and maintain an international economic system denominated in dollars and governed by American-dominated institutions like the IMF and World Bank. For decades, this bargain held because there was no alternative. The Soviet Union offered an alternative during the Cold War, but it collapsed. After 1991, there was no rival to American hegemony. But China's rise changes everything. For the first time in a generation, there's a genuine alternative to American dominance. And it's not just a military alternative, although China's military modernization is certainly part of the picture. It's an economic alternative, a technological alternative, a developmental model that offers a different path to prosperity. Whether that model actually delivers on its promises is a separate question, but the point is that countries now have a choice. They can continue aligning exclusively with the United States, or they can hedge their bets, diversify their partnerships, and extract better terms from both sides. This is exactly what Sheinbaum is doing, and it's exactly what we should expect rational leaders to do. The era of unquestioned American dominance is over. The era of multipolarity has begun. And Mexico, because of its geographic location, its economic size, its natural resources, and its historical relationship with the United States, is at the absolute center of this transition. What happens in Mexico over the next 5, 10, 15 years will determine the shape of the entire Western Hemisphere's political and economic future. Now, there's a tendency in American discourse to view all of this through the lens of great power competition, to see it as a game where there are winners and losers, where the goal is to maintain dominance, to contain rivals, to preserve hegemony. But that framing misses something crucial. From the perspective of countries like Mexico, this isn't about choosing sides in someone else's battle. It's about finally having the agency, the leverage, the options to pursue their own interests. For too long, Mexico and other Latin American countries have been objects of great power politics rather than subjects with their own goals and aspirations. What we're witnessing now is a fundamental shift where these countries are becoming active players rather than passive pieces on the chessboard. And that shift is threatening to the United States precisely because it means Washington can no longer simply dictate terms. It means American policymakers have to actually compete for influence, have to offer genuine benefits, have to treat partner countries with respect rather than condescension. This should have been happening all along, but American power was so overwhelming that it wasn't necessary. Now it is necessary, and the American political system seems ill-equipped to make the transition. The tragedy of all this, from an American perspective, is that it was entirely avoidable. If the United States had invested in Latin American development the way the Marshall Plan invested in rebuilding Europe after World War II, if American companies had created shared prosperity rather than extracting wealth, if American foreign policy had been based on genuine partnership rather than domination, China wouldn't have the opening it has now. Mexico and other Latin American countries would be firmly aligned with the United States, not because they had no choice, but because that alignment served their interests. But that's not the path the United States chose. Instead, decades of neglect, exploitation, and disrespect created the conditions for China's current success. And now, Trump's response to this challenge is to double down on the same failed approaches that created the problem in the first place. More threats, more tariffs, more demands, more disrespect. It's a recipe for accelerating exactly the trend he claims to oppose. Sheinbaum, meanwhile, is navigating this landscape with considerable skill. She's managed to maintain working relationships with both Washington and Beijing. She's extracted investment commitments from China while reassuring the United States that Mexico isn't abandoning the partnership. She's strengthened her domestic political position by demonstrating independence and defending Mexican sovereignty. She's positioned Mexico as a critical player in the global economy rather than a subordinate appendage to the American market. These are significant achievements and they represent a new chapter in Mexican history. But the story is far from over. The pressures on Mexico will only increase as the competition between the United States and China intensifies. Trump, or whoever follows him, will continue demanding that Mexico choose sides, that it restrict Chinese investment, that it align its policies more closely with American interests. China will continue offering attractive deals, seeking to deepen economic integration, pushing for political alignment on international issues. Sheinbaum and her successors will have to navigate between these competing pressures while managing domestic expectations and maintaining economic stability. The outcome of this competition will shape not just Mexico's future, but the future of the entire hemisphere and possibly the world. If Mexico successfully balances between the two powers and uses this competition to advance its own development, it could become a model for other countries seeking to navigate the new multipolar world. If the balancing act fails and Mexico is forced to choose sides, it will represent either a victory for continued American dominance or a breakthrough for Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. Either outcome would have profound implications for the global balance of power. What's clear is that the old rules no longer apply, the old assumptions no longer hold, and the old strategies no longer work. The United States can no longer take Mexican alignment for granted. China is a real competitor offering real alternatives, and Mexico, for the first time in a very long time, has genuine agency in determining its own future. That's the story that's unfolding right now. the story that will define the coming decades, the story that too few Americans understand, but that everyone needs to be paying attention to.